welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including a critique of the American system titled "The Tyranny of the Minority, a Marxist approach to reforming our government." An interesting article talking about how people act when they get power and how there actually could be a virtuous cycle from it, but it doesn't normally happen that way. And then we're going to talk about Kamala Harris's plans for the economy. And of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump into our daily debate. Throw down in that comment section whether or not you like the Electoral College. I have a feeling of how it's going to break down. I have a feeling that it's going to be the people that don't normally win the Electoral College not going to like it, and the people that do win the Electoral College, when they do win, are going to be very happy with it. But we're going to talk about it actually a lot today, especially in this first article. So put your comments down there, and then you can see what the general gist is of this next article in describing the issues with the Electoral College and me possibly defending part of the system that we have here in America. All right, with that said, let's jump into said article that comes from counterpunch.org. The headline reads, "The Tyranny of the Minority, a Marxist Appreciation and Critique." So the author actually goes through here, and he is critiquing / looking at a book that is written by two other authors and providing a little bit of extra context to their claims, kind of pushing back in other locations. So I'm going to skip over some of the part where he is just talking about the book, even though I do want to provide some context. But the later parts where he actually starts breaking it down, he says this is where you could go further, this is where you could continue to expand. Those sort of critiques where he delves into the Marxist ideas of things, I actually want to spend a little bit more time on those as well. Quote, "The U.S. is the planet's sole presidential democracy, in which the chief executive is directly elected through an electoral college instead of directly by the voters. Only in a self-declared world's greatest democracy." Wow, he's really going for the throat there immediately. Self-declared world's greatest democracy. I could say that we are most definitely the world's greatest democratic republic. I mean, there's no doubt about that, mainly because, like he says here, we're one of the only ones that does it that way. But also, the world's greatest democracy. What do you mean by that? Are we the most eminent power that has a semi-democratic form of government? Are we one of the largest economies and wealth builders throughout the entire world with a semi-democratic government? Are we the greatest military enforcer of said economic status / status quo across the world as a semi-democratic government? Yes, and yes. I don't think you can even argue it, because even if you want to say economically, there are other people that come up in your mind when you say, hey, they're great economic powers. First one that comes to mind for me is China. They are not a democracy. They are a one-party rule state, essentially. They claim to be a democracy, so fair enough to them, but if you're not a part of the CCP, if you're not elected internally in the CCP, you are not going to become the next Xi of the party and the ruler of China. So, yeah, I understand where the criticism's coming from, but maybe that's just a little bit too much word parsing for me. But it feels like he's coming for the throat immediately. I'm just like, okay, hey, chill here, my guy. But I'll continue the quote. Quote, "Can a president be elected in violation of the popular vote as occurred in 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, 2016? Thanks to a rightward bias of the Electoral College, a Democratic Party candidate today effectively needs to defeat their Republican-fascist opponent by 4 or more percentage points in the popular vote to win the U.S. presidency." So I'm going to focus on one word, and then I'll address the overall point. You see or heard how he said Republican-fascist. This is a recurring theme. He just calls the Republicans fascist all the way throughout, which is his opinion on the matter. Whatever, I'm going to keep using it because I'm going to be quoting from him, but just keep that in mind as you are listening. So, also, the rightward bias of the Electoral College, that is 100% true. It is 100% true, because some of the most populous states are represented in the Electoral College with more electoral votes, sure, but electoral vote per population is a little bit distorted. If you go to Wyoming, while it still has some blue in the state, it's pretty red, and it has less people overall than California. We know that, and yet proportionally, they have a few more electoral votes than the population. What the author argues here is this is actually a bias towards land, and I think that's an interesting argument. The fact that we value, or at least he sees it as a critique, I see it as an interesting argument, which is the value of land. We want people to be landowners. We want people in America to have a right to their own private property. So there would be some bias, at least when it comes to the inception of these sort of ideas, towards people that have land. Because guess what? If you are a renter and let's be clear, I'm not justifying that this is exactly how it is, but you can make an argument for it, which is if you're a renter in San Diego, meaning you don't actually own any property there, and you could pick up everything and drive away the next day, are you actually invested in San Diego? Are you invested in that community? Are you caring about its long-term health, or just your immediate needs? And then you could vote anyway that would actually be against the community, and then guess what? Oh, well, I didn't like the candidate, didn't like how it panned out, so I'm going to leave. Versus someone who buys property there, they're a little bit more invested. Then again, they could sell their property, but they can only sell their property for a higher value if they are going to make sure that the community, the overall city, is in good order, that the tax status is not too oppressive, that there are good schools, that the education system doesn't just provide good education because parents look for that, but also there are certain amenities to it. So you're actually more invested in the well-being of your community because of that. So I could see why you would actually make a system that would actually bias the landowners, at least to some degree, within the United States overall. Because guess what? Like I said, the San Francisco, the San Diego rule applies to the United States as a whole. If you own no land within the United States, you do not have to worry about as much the downfall of the American system because you can still pick up and leave, versus the people that depend on the U.S. government being stable and allowing prices, or being stable and actually keeping prices relatively stable, but also you rely on the power of the U.S. government, the protection that it provides in order to make sure that you can actually sell your land in the future that has any value whatsoever besides the inherent things you could do with it, aka farm it, aka build a factory, so on and so forth. So again, I could at least see a strong argument at the founding of the nation for that, no doubt about it. So why does it precipitate into the modern day? And why is there an even better argument that goes beyond the one that would probably have been initially put out there about, well, hey, we want to make sure our landowners, the people that are directly invested in the economy, have a say in the system. That's not to say that you disregard the people that are not landowners, because of course they have value too. They add to the economy even if they're not necessarily owning something. But you maybe give a little bit of a bias, a small bias, in the Electoral College is probably one way, especially if I take his critique as more realistic, then yeah, that's one way that you can actually bias them. But why is it important nowadays? I've had this conversation many times, why the Electoral College makes sense to some degree, which is the minority, the people that do not hold the majority opinion within the United States, should still have some say. And this author would make the argument that it's actually the minority that rules out. It's actually the minority that is able to completely control the system due to the Electoral College. But my question would be, if you're really criticizing the times that it went for the Electoral College instead of the popular vote, meaning the president won the Electoral College but didn't win the popular vote, meaning that there was an inverse there, that the popular will in his mind was not directly met by the Electoral College. Guess what? There are way more elections than 1824, than 1876, than 1888, than 2000, than 2016. There's 2020, there is 2012, there's 2004, there is 1996, there's 1992, there's 1988. You see where I'm going with this. There are so many more elections that actually had a popular opinion in the direct Democratic vote. And if it was a direct Democratic vote, aka the popular vote, was actually aligned with the Electoral College. So the counterexamples he provides are 5 out of roughly 48, so about 48 different elections. That percentage is absolutely minuscule, but that doesn't diminish the fact that they still did win. The question is, do you want a society that is only ruled by 51%? Because I'll tell you now, there are a lot of unpopular issues. There are a lot of issues that people may not agree with at 51%. 51% of the U.S. population would be okay with allowing abortion up to 6 weeks. 51% of the population would not be okay with abortions past 3 months. And either one of those issues, either one of the the extremes that I just mentioned, and I say extremes in that the one side of the argument versus the other, a lot of people, the minority of people, there are strong advocacy groups that would say, no, that's not acceptable. So if you truly only let the majority rule on everything, then you're going to not include a certain percentage of the population. So then the author goes on to mention, well, there's this rule called the filibuster, or there's this rule that we have to basically have a supermajority within the Senate. Basically, we have to reach 60% of the population. And he criticizes that further, saying, well, we can't just have, at the end of the day, we can't just have one extra senator. It couldn't just be 51-49 in order to get legislation passed. That basically stalls things. And the argument to me would be, yes, I understand that you do not like that it is not a simple majority, especially in a representative body that has exactly 100 people. It's very symbolic. It makes the math very, very easy for everybody who wants to do a percentage breakdown. Oh, you need 60 senators to sign on to your bill. But the idea of having a supermajority proves that the minority is even smaller, that they are not even close to a majority of the population. It is not a thin margin that you are actually convincing people in order to come to your side and make sure that they are representing the wishes of their people, their constituents. And I think that this system, while it still infringes upon the minority a little bit, the closer you get to an absolute, not just a percentage majority, but an absolute majority, you get to an absolutely unified decision, aka 100%. The closer you get to that, the better. Are we going to cowtail for 5% of the population? No, I think that's extremely hard to make. That doesn't mean that they don't have some electoral power, because guess what? Because of the Electoral College, the president does have to go and care about that 5% of the population if it's based solely in one state. They do have to care about that 5% when going out and being elected. So if they pander to them, that's one thing, but they at least have to hear them out. And then same thing for 10, 15, 20%. Should we let them absolutely rule our country? Not necessarily. That's basically getting to an oligopoly, or the first one's definitely at oligopoly, and we're kind of going down from an oligopoly, but we're still there. 30% questionable, 35% questionable, 40%, you're starting to go like, oh, well, that's still a pretty large chunk, and then you start to go up from there. But the whole point about having a minority rule system is, from the author's perspective, is to limit the ability of the people to revolt, to have a revolution in order to rise up against the current system and revolutionary and change it through revolutionary means. And you may be thinking, whoa, Alex, what are you talking about? That sounds like it is really over the top. And I would say, yeah, it definitely sounds like it's over the top, but that's not because I'm being hyperbolic. That is because this is exactly what the author, Paul Street, says. I'm going to read a really long quote here. Stick with me. Quote, "Our critical historical task is to get a revolutionary socialism which will inevitably combine authoritarian aspects with democratic characteristics, since class inequality and class struggle do not magically disappear just because a revolution has occurred." Let me repeat one specific line. Quote, "We will inevitably combine authoritarian aspects with democratic characteristics, since class inequality," so on and so forth. I'll keep going with the rest of the quote. Quote, "The goal of democracy should never be abstracted from and understood as above and beyond the real historical material context within which it is studied. A revolutionary socialist state, certain to be embattled within and without, will hardly be a pure or ideal democracy, but it will push much further down the egalitarian path of popular sovereignty than a bourgeoisie democracy." So I'll break down the two things that he's saying there, one in subtext, one outright. The outright one. Okay, he's saying that we need a revolution in order to overthrow this current system so that we can have a more socialist society, even though that will be imbued with more authoritarian aspects. So basically, he's paying lip service to democracy, but admitting fully that the ideal form of government that he would impose, that he would want, is actually one that is not going to be more democratic, but it will have more authoritarian aspects. Then again, our system does already have a large concentration of power that forces people to do a lot of things. So you could make an argument that it's not necessarily that far off. Now, I would say it is pretty far off. That doesn't mean there aren't little tidbits here and there. The other one is the subtext is that we need to have a pure democracy so it is easier and the minority cannot just simply vote it down or present any pressure or provide any sort of block to having a uprising, because all you would need is convince 51% of the population of the validity of your argument. All you would need is 51% of the population completely dissatisfied. All you would need is 51% of the population in order to actually uprise. And it could be less than that, especially when you go to a pure democracy, because guess what starts to happen? For the most part, you start to have more coalitional governments because there's not a more robust party system that's able to necessarily block out a pure democracy election. Not always, but remember, there are Democrats and there are Republicans that have basically gerrymandered the districts within their states in order, and I think that's a very valid critique from this author here, not going to lie, that have been able to gerrymander their districts in order to guarantee that the majority of people there vote Republican and Democrat. Imagine doing that in the future. Imagine being able to gerrymander, even when we have a more open process, but restrict basically third parties from gaining any sort of power based on the makeup of the district, and the Republicans and Democrats coming together and saying, hey, we want to keep this third party out, so we're going to change the district so just barely there's not enough independents in order to actually get an electoral win. So yes, I can understand where the author comes from, especially on gerrymandering. I think that the criticisms are not out of a bad place of their heart. I just think they are being very deceptive when they say, hey, we should have democracy. But realistically, they're saying we need to use democracy as a tool in order to get what we actually want. It's very cynical, and I think even the arguments against a system that actually gives a little bit more weight to the minority also fall flat on their face. But hey, that's enough from me. If you want to read the rest of that article, it'll be linked in the description. Let's jump to our second article that comes from the American Institute of Economic Research. The headline reads, "People without meaningful lives seek power over others." And if I was a cynical person, if I was a mean person, I would say Mr. Paul Street is one of these people, but I actually am not cynical, and I'm an optimist, and I think he genuinely derives passion from what he's doing there. I don't think that when he mentions the authoritarian moment that he wants to be the authoritarian. I think he sees a beautiful system wherein a little bit more control over the populace is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it is held by a trustworthy person who is not corruptible. Well, guess what? This author says that, I don't know. Normally, the people that seek power, they're the ones that are actually already corrupted. So I want to read a very specific mention here. He has a nice little anecdote in the beginning talking about the exchange he has with a student, though I do not want to dive into that one. I actually want to get to the first quote that I thought was very, very important. Quote, "Then the memorable exchange occurred. One student shared that he would prefer to live in the 1700s if he had more money than others and power over them. My first reaction was amusement. I thought the student was practicing his deadpan humor skills. He wasn't. For him, having power was a attribute of a meaningful life." So, hear that out. He's talking about the French during the 1700s and the power that the king has over people. And the argument would go, well, hey, I'm going to have a great life. I'm going to have 498 servants making me food. And nowadays in the modern economy, some economists would argue, hey, no, actually, you have probably more people doing services for you. There are more people involved in getting that chicken to you and getting that steak that you're eating to you across the supply chain. So in some theory, you actually have more than 498 people helping you out in order to get this food on your table. So, and the author goes on to break down how standard of living, even for the richest at the time, is so much larger and so much better here in the modern era. But I want to get to the synthesis of what the author's getting at here. He brings a few different points together, and he brings some Pascal together. He actually brings Frankel together, and they create a interesting hypothesis, or he creates an interesting hypothesis about power and the limits of power in actually providing some sort of semblance of a happy life. Quote, among the ways Frankel believed we could make meaning were through purposeful actions, creative endeavors, and loving others. Entrepreneurial activities, the pursuit of new ways of serving customers' most urgent needs, is fertile ground for making meaning. Quote, this is from Frankel himself, for too long we have been dreaming a dream from which we are now waking up. The dream that if we improve the socioeconomic situation of people, everything will be okay. People will become happy. The truth is that the struggle for survival has been subsided. The question has emerged, survival for what? And then he goes on to call this a neurotic fatalism. It hides the basic fact of human life. People who make meaning in their lives don't seek freedom from conditions. They realize that they have the freedom to take a stand towards those conditions. And I think that that is a beautiful, beautiful idea. And I don't agree with this author wholeheartedly in that power is only a tool for the author doesn't necessarily suggest that power is the only tool that people strive for when they're bored. Obviously not. That would be idiotic. Because guess what? A lot of people that are bored nowadays, they don't seek power. They just seek to sit down and watch whatever they want to watch. But he does say that the people seeking power, and they're normally doing it out of a sense of they want control over other people. They don't have a better way to provide meaning within their life, but also that they already have a quote-unquote corrupted soul, or they already have a corrupted moral code is probably the better way to put it, that's not biblical. And I think that he's onto something, but also I don't want to deny the people that genuinely seek out higher office and seek out power in order to help people. It can actually be a calling. What do you think a pastor is? What do you think a clergyman who rises up is? Back in the day, sure, you could make an argument that it was simply because, well, hey, I'm the second son. I'm not going to get the estate. I have to go make my living. I'm going to go be a clergyman. And they were just following that as maybe a path for God. Nowadays, you have a lot of economic opportunities in other places. You're not restricted like that. The clergy is not just a way for the second son to be ensured that he's going to make a living and be able to live without the support of his father, his mother, and the rest of his family. Well, nowadays, if you choose to be a pastor, you are choosing to go and lead people. Now, maybe you can have a bad moral code in there. I'm not trying to deny that. Everybody is not immune from this. But the idea that there aren't genuinely good people who want to go out and lead and have some semblance of power, because the pastor has power of their flock, the local city councilman has a little bit of power, and some state politicians have a little bit of power. Even some national politicians, I believe, can actually be good people. I don't want to be overly optimistic and naive. Of course, the longer you're there, the longer you are going to be corrupted, the less you're going to care about your constituents, the more you're going to care about your friends in Washington. Not always, but it tends to happen that way, and maybe there is a sense of boredom that comes in once you feel like you can't get things done and you seek more power. But overall, that is completely dismissive of the fact that you can, and there are good people who seek power in order to do just things. And I don't think the author is making an extreme case of, okay, only the powerful are the ones that are seeking it out because of boredom. No, I don't think that's true. What I think he's saying is that if you have a morally corrupted nature and you're bored, seeking power and being able to actually force upon others your terrible moral code is actually enjoyable. There's a perverse sense of joy and a false sense of meaning that comes from it. And I think that he's right on most parts, especially how he synthesizes the Pascal that he starts with, which you can go read in his article, and also the Frankel, because I think that he brings those two together pretty nicely now. And I think it is interesting that if you have a pure majority system, the people that are truly trying to exploit the will of the people and are trying to simply push their will upon others, if they just are able to convince 51% of the population that they are the right person, that they are the ones that should wield power, then it's done. It's over. If it's a pure democracy, guess what? Boom, there you go. He's in. Versus having a system that actually allows for a little bit of play, that allows the minority to have their say. You can actually have up to maybe 53, 55% of the population, especially depending on where they're voting from, that says, hey, you know what? We're all on board. But that extra 45% is enough to say, hey, let's calm down here. These are checks and balances. We need to have checks and balances against people who truly are the people just seeking power in order to satiate something within themselves, because that only means, in my opinion, that the power is their meaning, and without that power, they will feel useless. They will feel like they are nothing. And guess what happens then? They oppress. They destroy our rights. They destroy the fundamental freedoms that he just talked about because they cannot see themselves without said power. All right. But that's enough on that one. Let's jump into our final article. I thought it was a pretty good one that came from The Hill. And the headline reads, here's what's in Kamala Harris's plan for the economy. And I'll be honest, they provide a little something, but not necessarily too much. So I'm going to go through each headline and read a quick excerpt, then we'll break it down. Quote, boosting the child tax credit. Quote, the CTC, they want the CTC to, quote, provide a $6,000 tax cut to families with newborn children, as Democrats sought to drive a contrast between Republicans on the issue in recent weeks. So then we go on to the price gouging section. Quote, the plan calls for what is described as the first ever federal ban on price gouging on foods and groceries, though it doesn't offer much detail as how the proposal would be carried out. And they interestingly leave out the part where she proposed, she didn't say that she's doing it, she proposed possible price controls. That would be an interesting one. It would go over terribly. But then again, our guy from the very first article might be like, ooh, okay, we're going into a little bit of socialism, Marxism, direct control over the prices of goods. Yeah, we could definitely have that. All right, then we go into our next section, expanding affordable housing. Quote, the plan calls for an expansion to an existing tax credit for businesses that build affordable rental houses, as well as a $40 billion federal fund to help boost construction. The plan also details a proposal to make some federal lands eligible for repurposing for new and affordable housing developments. And then there's the limiting taxes on tips that kind of took it from Donald Trump, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because if it's a good policy, it's a good policy. If both sides are doing it, maybe Trump is over there, oh, why is she taking my policies? Look, but honestly, Trump, be happy. She saw that you were leading on a particular issue. She saw that you were resonating with the people because you were looking out for them, and she is following them, because at the end of the day, you're looking out for the American people, not just yourself and your own political goals, your own machinations towards power. Helping first-time home buyers. So, quote, the first-generation home buyers will be given $25,000 in down payment assistance, along with the tax credit for first-time home buyers. So, you can see here, they outline a whole bunch of different ideas. I think a lot of them are too interventionist. I think some of them are pretty solid. I think the theory behind and the messaging behind one, especially the child tax credit and the home buyers one, even if I don't necessarily agree, then again, the child tax credit one, I think that it could definitely be worked. Instead, I think we should just give them a tax cut, maybe not $6,000, somewhere around $3,000. At the end of the day, that's still direct manipulation of the economy, because you're telling people what they should and should not be spending money on, basically. Oh, you should spend money on having a child, because therefore we're going to subsidize that behavior, and we're going to distort the actual buying power that you have, because one, we're just printing money, but also we're just giving you money, so you have unrealistic expectations of what you're able to do with said money, how much you have to invest, so on and so forth. But overall, I like the sentiment behind it. We should be having more children. And I think the affordable housing one is a huge overstep, even though I do like the sentiment. I like the idea of the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris looking out, just like Donald Trump has, looking out for homeowners, home builders, and people who they're actually trying to encourage property ownership, because, like I said at the very beginning of this segment, there is the necessary idea that people who are invested in this country, invested in their areas, should be the ones who have a very large say, or at least should have a say in the system, because guess what? They are looking towards the future. Same with people who have children, because they're looking towards the future. You're not going to destroy America. You're not going to revolt against America if you have property here that will be valueless if America goes away. You're not going to revolt against America if you believe that in revolting you'll destroy the country where your children will grow up, and then they'll grow up worse off. Those are both mechanisms in order to be private property, and children are both mechanisms to have people and citizens who are invested in the country. So I like the sentiment. I don't necessarily love the way that they would go about them. But hey, that's enough. I think we made a pretty coherent episode, but that doesn't mean it's over, because we still have to go to our daily delight. And this one comes from our friends over at Parade Pets. Ragdoll cat makes the most unlikely backyard buddy thanks to an unlocked gate. And I'll be honest, when I heard the idea of a deer and a cat hanging out, I was like, no, that doesn't make no sense to me. Even deer and dog, like sure, I can kind of see it. Something pops into my brain, but honestly, it's not that clear, so to speak. So when I saw this article, I was like, oh, okay, let's see what's going on here. If you want to read this one, you want to see the cute interactions, if you want to see a link to the video on social media, all of today's articles as well will be in the link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.